Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine war news update for the 13th of May 2023. Let's go straight to our usual opening points, our usual starting point, sorry. It's the Ukraine general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply, of course. Now, uh, I guess given that Bakhmut is the only really focal point along the entire front line, where activity is consistently happening every day and in multiple places around that settlement. We the liquidated personnel figures are sometimes, well, at the moment they are pretty low. I think we are in this transitional period between the two offensives. That said, 590 is still higher than average. It's just lower than where it has been, lower than it was yesterday. So that's the liquidated personnel figure. 6 tanks, 12 APCs are fairly high on the APCs there. 6 tanks is significant. As I keep mentioning, I think tank losses are lower because Russia simply don't have the tanks to throw onto the front line. I think they're running short on tanks for operational purposes. Now, this is the big one. 27 artillery systems. 27 artillery systems. So even if that is vaguely accurate, maybe even if that's 60%, the reality is 60% of that, that's still a huge artillery loss for the day to MLRS as well. I've been talking a lot about how Ukraine are targeting artillery explicitly ahead of the counteroffensive, and because also artillery is one of the biggest killers of troops on both sides. 2 anti-aircraft warfare systems is also significant, above average, but it does depend on what systems they might be. 29 drones, there were drone strikes last night, 15 vehicles and fuel tanks, and nine pieces of special equipment. Now, that could be deminers, it could be excavators, but it could also be electronic warfare systems and radar systems. So, as you can see, nine is the average is less than one a day for pieces of special equipment. We are seeing routinely every day something like two a day is basically where it's been at, sometimes higher. And then a day like that, 9 pieces is significant, but 27 artillery systems is phenomenal. So the Russians must really be hurting in terms of, well, I'd say offensive capability, but defensive capability as well. Uh, with the loss of all these bits of kit. Now, a Mi-28 attack helicopter has crashed near Zhankoy in Crimea. Both crew members perished, says the Russian MOD. So that is official. So they've lost a helicopter. That's not reflected in the figures there, which is quite surprising because that seemed to happen in the daytime yesterday. On May the 6th, dozens of Ukrainian troops advanced on the Russian foxholes. Intelligence suggested that Russians were so focused on the intense street battles playing out inside Bakhmut, they were not expecting an assault in this direction. So the Washington Post has done a piece on what's been going on around Bakhmut. That is continuing today. I'll talk about that on my frontline update. But it is difficult for the Russians around Bakhmut. Intelligence suggested that Russians were so focused on the intense street battles playing on outside that they weren't expecting the attack around the edges. And on May the 5th and 6th, Russian soldiers hammered the position held by the 127th Territorial Defense Brigade so many times that after the fourth wave of attack, the Ukrainians could no longer keep track of the dead and wounded Russians outside, said the brigade commander, Colonel Roman Hrishchenko. Hrishchenko described how his 127th Brigade rations ammunition for its howitzer, while each day the Russians are covering every square mile with shells until every building is destroyed. If I had that opportunity to use that much artillery, I would probably finish the war. When you get Russians, and I still get pro-Russian voices on my thread saying, you say that the Ukrainians are killing way more than the Russians, but the Russians are firing 5 times as many shells a day, blah, blah, blah. And I've already done an explicit video and I did a presentation on why that can be the case. And yet the Russians are still losing overwhelmingly higher numbers of troops. And their inaccurate shelling is just kind of designed to flatten areas where the Ukrainian shelling is designed to specifically hit targets, which will be troop concentrations, which would be like pieces of equipment. So the Russians are just flattening and using huge amounts of artillery shells to do what seems like quite a lot of damage to buildings, but is that quite a lot of damage to the Ukrainian troop numbers? Arguably not. Uh, so yeah, lots going on around Bakhmut still. Right. This is Peter Clifford online saying that Ukrainian East Command claims that they have liberated 17.3 square kilometers yesterday, north and south of the city, or not all yesterday, but over the last few days. Ukrainian commanders say better weather and the arrival of US infantry fighting vehicles and weapons have made a significant difference. Now that is worthy of note there for sure. So it could be that they are starting to get some of that equipment that should be used for the counteroffensive writ large, but some of that equipment could have found its way to to Bakhmut. And Andrew Perpetua says in the last 24 to 48 hours, leaning more towards 24, north of Bakhmut, Ukraine has reversed about 2.5 months worth of Russian advances. And this is what a lot of pro Ukrainians are looking forward to seeing, which is the undoing of all of this incredibly labor intensive gains that the Russians have made just in a matter of days. And it speaks a lot to the Ukrainian defense previously, making it that difficult for the Russians to gain, and a potentially crumbling Russian defense. So, yeah, lots happening there. And Prigozhin still saying his usual stuff. The flanks are crumbling, the front is collapsing, everything is leading to a global tragedy for Russia. So, Russian defense ministry units fled from the flanks, and that's his usual kind of whinging. But he's probably got a point. Explosions in Russian-occupied Luhansk city. So I did a separate video on this last night because it was quite big news. Still don't know what missiles hit. Some are saying it was a Storm Shadow. In fact, the Russians are, I think, claiming today pretty formally it was a Storm Shadow. But others are saying it was more likely the Hrim-2, the Ukrainian's own indigenous missile. Some saying it's GLSDB, ground-launched small diameter bombs. But Luhansk was hit, it looks like a couple of times. Luhansk city, this is. Just to give you an idea of where that is. Luhansk city is right back here. So it's a good 100 kilometers from the front line and a good, really, 130 kilometers from where you want to safely launch anything, whether it's air launched or ground launched. So Luhansk was hit. Now, as I say, people are still unsure exactly what was targeted, what was there. A machine building plant in the city of Luhansk near the state circus has reportedly been struck by at least 2 Ukrainian missiles, causing a massive fire. Emergency crews are currently on scene. So this was yesterday. I reported exactly this. Factory appears to have been totally destroyed, with multiple office and industrial buildings nearby suffering severe damage from the explosion and resulting fire. However, it appears that firefighters have contained the fire only to the factory complex. Now, OSINT Defender said the contrails from one of the Ukrainian missiles seen shortly after the explosions in Luhansk suggest to him that the altitude and the contrails indicate a ballistic missile, probably a Tochka, but definitely not Storm Shadows or any other kind of cruise missile. So that is his conclusion. Alongside of that missile, for those who didn't watch that video last night, there were parts of the ADM-160 MALD air-launched decoy missiles. So these are sent to basically attract the air defense, often sent alongside or before the real missile that you want to send. And these will attract air defense to take out air defense missiles so that your actual, the true missile gets through, if you like. It's developed and produced by the US, never been announced in any aid packages to Ukraine. The ADM-160 is used for saturation and disruption air defenses, allowing the air defense systems to target the decoy missile instead of other armed missiles. Only the US military aircraft such as F-16 and B-52s are known to be capable of launching these. So it most likely means that they have found some way to mount them on Ukrainian MiG-29s. And that would be huge. Obviously, if we're talking about the Storm Shadow, that has been the case for the Storm Shadows as well. They've been adapted to probably MiG-29. So it could well be that they, at the same time, they allow for this capability as well. Occupation authorities claim that the administrative buildings of defunct enterprises Polypak and Milan were destroyed by Ukrainian cruise missiles Hrim. So that's a claim from the Russians that it's Hrim. I've seen elsewhere the Russians claiming it was definitely Storm Shadows. Now, the Russians are also claiming, I mean, this is Russia Today, 6 children injured in strike on Luhansk. Um, yeah, so I wonder whether that is just completely psyops. I don't really wonder that is. I mean, they've sold that as injury to children rather than hitting a military target. But again, what was it that was hit? There's lots of thought about what that might have been. If the Ukrainians are going to use weaponry that they probably don't have huge stocks of, then you can bet that there would be a very definite target there that they were trying to hit. They wouldn't have wasted missiles like that in the same way that Russia appears to have done over the course of the war. I think Ukraine would be using the very best intelligence to target very particular, um, to target very particular military installations. So, Tim White, to go on to a slightly different topic, talking about, well, it's still strikes. This was a strike that happened that I reported yesterday in Melitopol. So earlier in today's thread, he said yesterday, I wrote about the explosion in Melitopol with Russia saying no one was injured. Turns out another collaborator, Deputy Minister of Construction and Housing in the occupied part of Zaporizhia, was hit by an IED. He's in hospital. So that was yesterday's strike on Melitopol. And actually, there's been another strike today, another explosion tonight in Melitopol. Power has been knocked out in many of the northern suburbs of the occupied city. No more details about what was hit by whom and what the potential casualties were. So Melitopol is still being targeted. And also this morning, there are reports of powerful explosions in Mariupol near Avostal. Andriy um, advisor to the mayor of the city, said. So again, shaping the battlefield for the events to come. We also have heard that there are other strikes on Luhansk this morning. So another strike there with the Ukrainian missiles, or a missile. I don't know the details of that. That's just coming through. So again, Luhansk now in the targets, in the crosshairs of the Ukrainians. Um, this is Luhansk as well. This morning, um, there was an attack. Sorry, I said didn't have any other details. Actually, this is the other bit of footage that's come out. Attack on an old building of the Luhansk Academy of Internal Affairs, Russian media write. Since 2015, the Russian military has been stationed there. There may be dead and wounded. I don't know whether this is significant damage. There just looks like, very cosmetic damage here, but I don't know. That said, there don't seem to be any windows left in the area. So, yeah, I don't know the details of that. Going on to Russian hits. So we should, Ben Hodges says, we should give the Ukrainian Air Force what it needs to stop Russian attacks, which target innocent Ukrainian civilians. We're de facto giving Russia sanctuary to murder civilians because we don't give the Ukrainian Air Force capability to strike the sources of those strikes, which come from within Crimea and Russia. So there were hits on Mykolaiv, Khmelnytsky, and Lviv and Kiev. So these are a couple of places. So this is a really big explosion there. Let's just have a look at that. This is a worrying explosion. Not sure what the target is. And let's just make sure it's not crazy loud for you. So as you can see, that is a big explosion. Now that happened in Khmelnytsky, ski in which is in western, broadly over into western Ukraine. So that is a significant explosion, an awful long way back. And the argument is, well, how can they be able to get missiles that far back into Ukraine? And indeed, Lviv was mentioned there as well. So they're obviously able to do damage all the way back there, and Kiev as well. Although I heard an explosion last night, and an ambulance basically being on fire, but there was thought that it wasn't actually the air raid sirens weren't going, so it might have been just a random explosion and an exploding ambulance for some reason, or a fire in an ambulance. So I'm not sure that Kiev was definitely hit by air attacks last night, but I could be wrong. An innocent defender here says at least 10 explosions have been heard in and around the city of Khmelnytsky in western Ukraine. As it's reported, Russian Shahed 136 kamikaze drones have struck multiple critical infrastructure sites, causing severe damage, massive fires, and debris to rain across the city. So that you can see there are some big old hits on that city. So it is the Russians are giving the Ukrainians as good as they get. Today, Russian troops, has flash news. Russian troops launched 7 missiles, 49 airstrikes, 81 shells with the MLRS. They again use S-300s for missile strikes on Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, and Zaporizhia. So still doing what they do pretty much every day there. As far as the drones are concerned, 17 strike drones of the Shahed 136 and 131 type were destroyed last night. 21 were launched, so 4 got through. In addition, there were all antennas and 4 Lancets taken out as well yesterday. So that's your kind of drone update. Let's move on to other things and military aid. Right. So with regard to military aid, just going to focus a little bit on the Storm Shadow again. Trentelenko says the Missile Technology Control Regime, MTCR, means signatories don't export missiles with more than 299-kilometer range. The UK is a founding signer. So based on that, I'd expect a 250-kilometer to 299-kilometer range on any Storm Shadow provided to Ukraine. Someone replies, well, I do laugh when I see the MBDA Storm Shadow's export range being quoted as 150 to 200 kilometers, when it is well known that the range for the export version, called Black Shaheen, in service with the United Arab Emirates, is 1,000 kilometers. RSAF Storm Shadow ranges also not as low as 150 kilometers in low either. Shashank Joshi says, he's the Economist defense editor, there's a nice arms control wonk post on the export of Storm Shadow and its range from 2011. France and the UK calculated the range of the missile at sea level instead of the more efficient high altitude flight profile that the missile actually follows. So interesting with the flight path being high there. So those missiles that we were looking at earlier, the contrails to the missiles, could have been from Storm Shadow. I mean, it can do stealthy low level stuff as well. I believe it just depends, I guess, how it's set. France and the UK went ahead with the UAE sale over the US objections. MBDA reduced the fuel load of the Black Shaheen to make it a less egregious violation of the MTCR, but it's listed, the range is listed as exceeding 250 miles or about 400 kilometers. In other words, there are good arguments to suggest that could easily hit the Kerch Bridge and anywhere in Crimea, Sevastopol, etc., etc. Okay, moving on from Storm Shadow, BM Oplot is the most modern variant of the Ukrainian T-84 main battle tank. The army adopted the BM Oplot in 2009, but only a handful were ever purchased. The Ukrainian T-84 series are based on a Soviet-designed T-80. So the Ukrainian MOD is purchasing indigenous Oplot tanks for the army. Again, as ever with these kind of bits of news, is what would the timeframes on manufacturing these indigenously? Can they be manufactured fully indigenously? Ukroboronprom is the defense conglomerate that makes these. Let's have a look at what was said here. I'm convinced that a Ukrainian tank such as the Oplot should be at the forefront of the tank coalition. There must be an armored fist on the front line because the most important value is to save the lives of our defenders and defendresses, says Reznikov in Kharkiv. So he's gone to look around one. So you could start. I mean, really, Ukrainian defense industry needs to be operating at insane levels at the moment to get as much stuff produced as they possibly can. And it would be great if they could meaningfully produce tanks. Now, the biggest bit of news, possibly the biggest bit of news of all of today, is the German announcement that they are transferring to Ukraine armaments worth about 2.7 billion euros. So this is their biggest promise yet. The equipment list will include 20 Marder, 30 Leopard 1s, 18 wheeled howitzers, 4 Iris-Ts, air defense system, 12, that's SLM, 12 Iris-T SLS launchers, hundreds of guided missiles for the system, 200 reconnaissance drones, more than 100 logistics support vehicles. This is really good news. So the 18 RCH 155 howitzers, those are, as it mentions, wheeled self-propelled howitzers. We've seen they're quite small looking vehicles, but great shoot and scoot howitzers. 15 Gepards there in this iteration of the list, additional shells and ammunition, so on and so forth. So this is a fantastic, fantastic announcement by the Germans. Really meaningful stuff. The question is always, how quickly can they get that stuff to Ukraine? Is this like 2 years down the line? It'd be great if they could get IRIS-T air defense systems into Ukraine as soon as possible. They are super important. So yeah, fantastic news from Germany. Really good. Cyprus's defense minister says that the island nation is working together with Irish and US military experts to help train 2 groups of Ukrainian personnel in clearing an untold number of unmarked minefields in their homeland. Really good news. I mentioned this, I think, yesterday's news, that the Irish were involved, even though they're a neutral country. They are actually training deminers. Fantastic. Now, I can't find any evidence of this elsewhere. So take this possibly with a pinch of salt. I'd be very surprised if these guys are reporting it just out of thin air, but it could be. The Swiss Parliament has voted through a new law that will make it possible to send military equipment to Ukraine. I've seen this in a couple of places on the socials, but I haven't seen a link to anywhere in the news that reports this. There's no mainstream media reporting of this that I can find. So I don't know if that is definitely true, but yeah, I'll let you know in the next few days if that is, because that will be super significant as well. And my Swiss viewers can let me know if something's happened on that front. In Russia, says Tim White, more people are fleeing the army than ever before. Official data shows that first 4 months of this year there have been more desertions than in any other year. Courts may be getting a lot fuller soon too. Yet another small waste of Russians' money. So here we have a pretty exponential increase in desertions. In the first 4 months of 2023, the courts have already received more cases of unauthorized abandonment of a military unit than in the entire past year. Parts is already more than for the entire previous year, and it's important to consider that these figures do not reflect the number of those whose cases did not reach the court. At the same time, the courts, as a rule, give the military suspended sentences. In such decisions, judges sometimes directly write that they will leave the defendant at large in order to send him to war. The court takes into account the petition for imposing a sentence not related to real imprisonment for the defendant to be sent in accordance with the established procedure to the zone of a special military operation, where he will be able to prove his correction by his behavior and deeds. So, yeah, that speaks volumes, I think, for the war situation in Russia and how it's being received by those who are being called up to do the warfare. Well, then, I've actually done a bit of almost live research in between these segments, and it turns out there is something from the Swiss Parliament here. Swiss Parliament Committee recommends eased weapons re-export rules. After months of refusing re-export Swiss war material to Ukraine, a parliamentary committee in Switzerland has recommended easing export controls. And yeah, so it looks like that definitely is happening. Buyers could re-export Swiss arms after 5 years under certain conditions. Re-exports to countries that severely violate human rights or pose a risk to the civilian population would be banned. This would allow the re-export of Swiss-made weapons to Ukraine, but not to Russia. Interesting. This comes amid concerns that the country's defense needs are not substantial enough for the domestic industry to survive and thrive at current levels, and that current strict re-export rules could deter other nations from buying from Swiss suppliers in the future. And it's exactly what I've been saying over over the last few months whenever I've talked about the Swiss neutrality, is that it makes no sense to have a defense industrial industry and a defense industry, export industry, and also be neutral. You can't have those two things, and they're finding that out. We can't have these really strict rules and expect our defense industry to flourish. It won't be able to do that. We can't export these things to countries that need them, especially if they aren't like in this case, the aggressors. They are the defenders. So that's going to be really, I think, good news for Ukraine going forward. It just, I guess, depends how quickly that can manifest itself in Gepard ammunition, for example, going to Ukraine. Right. Okay, moving on to geopolitical subjects. It's been announced that Zelensky will travel to Rome. So it says tomorrow there. That's today. So he has arrived in Rome, as far as I understand now. So it'd be interesting to see what comes out of that visit. Financial Times: EU plans to build internet cable to reduce Georgia's reliance on Russia. So is the EU getting strategically involved in Georgia? And trying to prize it away from Russian influence. The EU is planning to build an internet cable in the Black Sea's international waters to improve Georgia's digital connectivity and reduce its reliance on Russia, the FT reported. Fascinating. Right. Polish prosecutors aim to find out how Schroeder may have used his positions in the Russian energy sector to exert pressure on EU countries and Ukraine. So Gerhard Schroeder is a former chancellor of Germany, and he is very much aligned with Russia. Indeed, Putin, kind of personally. He got into trouble recently. I don't think I reported this, but he was slammed for attending a party on Victory Day at the Russian embassy. So he went there. I mean, this Kiev Post article adds a bit of meat to the bone here. He was seen at the event. He's held a number of positions in Russian energy companies, has seen many of the privileges normally given to ex-chancellors taken away for his ties to the Kremlin. He no longer has a publicly funded private office, but members of current Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the Social Democrats, have so far failed to expel his predecessor from the party. I find it incomprehensible, senior Social Democrat MP Katja Must said in response to Schroeder's attendance. Gerhard Schroeder's behavior can hardly be surpassed in its tastelessness, said senior Conservative CDU politician Torsten Frey. On the day the former chancellor was entertained by Russian diplomats, innocent people in Ukraine died as a result of the Russian war of aggression. So yeah, he is in trouble in a more of a PR way there, but here, has he been exerting pressure on EU countries on behalf of the Russian energy sector? So yeah, that's something we'll see how that develops over the coming days. From London, a former Moldovan police chief stands accused of masterminding a Russian plot to destabilize Moldova's pro-Western government. I've reported previously on the Russian influence in fomenting discord in Moldova to try and unseat the the pro-EU, pro-Western government in Moldova, and could well be part of that. And this is someone doing that from London, a former Moldovan police chief. Two more quick pieces. This is in light of the elections in Turkey that are due to take place imminently. It looks like Erdogan should lose the election, but you never know. I mean, he came out and campaigned overtly yesterday saying, "We are against the gays." And like, as if that's going to, well, I mean, the idea would be to really reinforce that kind of conservative outlook. He's relied, I think, previously on a lot of support from outside of the urban centres, maybe playing into that. I don't know. But at the same time, he's been very clever in walking this very fine line between Russia and the rest and the West and Ukraine, where on the one hand he recognizes that he gets a lot of money in trade and a lot of dodgy money comes into Turkey from Russia. And on the other hand, they're part of NATO and they have to be seen to be doing the right thing there, and also selling weapons to Ukraine, and Ukraine have got loads of Turkish weapons. So he's been able to do that. But what they have done is not really sanction the Russians, welcoming in Russian money, oligarchs and their yachts. And Ukraine the Latest did a really good segment on this yesterday. I'm just going to dip into this for a couple of minutes just to give you a flavour.
And they really have. You know, I went down a little internet wormhole into these marine vessel tracking websites and started looking at where all of the super yachts were. And a lot of these super yachts that are linked to sanctioned oligarchs, Roman Abramovich among them, you know, they're all clustered around these wonderful beachy ports on the Turkish coast. And I was talking to a guy who runs a company that works for the Russian elite, and these wealthy Russians. He's talking about them as a collective body, not just the ones that have been sanctioned. He was like, their lives are fine. They've gone to Dubai, they've gone to Turkey. They're still enjoying a really high quality of life.
What do we know about what they get up to in Turkey? What are their lives like?
Well, they are spending quite a lot of money. The numbers are really clear. The Turkish government actually has very good data on property transactions and the breakdown of foreign ownership of property transactions. So in 2022, Russian investment into Turkish property nearly tripled, jumped from about 5,300 deals in 21 to 16,300 deals last year. And that momentum has continued into March this year as the latest data available. They've gone from being sort of the third largest foreign buyer contingent in Russia to the largest, and the largest by 2 or 3 times the second contingent, which is Iran. They're also setting up a huge number of companies in Turkey. That figure rose more than 8 times over between 2021 and 2022, climbing to 1,363. And that's data from the Union of Chambers and Commodity Exchanges of Turkey. There's a big flow of money into Turkey. And, one of the things that happens if you buy Turkish property, if you spend $400,000 on a Turkish property, you also get a Turkish passport. So that huge spike in Turkish property purchases is probably also quite closely tied to a huge spike in Turkish passport issues to Russians.
That's really interesting.
That is fascinating. I mean, you can just buy yourself a Turkish passport. $400,000, I get a property and I get a passport. Job done. And that's a way that Russians appear to be, able to get around sanctions or mitigate against sanctions, or so on and so forth. So, Turkey is playing an important role in softening the blow to Turkish oligarchs. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is Eurovision. So, Eurovision, for those who live in America, you might not know, and elsewhere, you might not know how big Eurovision is. It's a big thing across Europe. It's this singing competition that is incredibly camp. It's really positive. It's just lots of glitz and color, and often some very bad songs with a couple of decent songs thrown in as well. And everyone votes, and actually the voting is entirely culturally political. So you get, Turkey and Cyprus and Greece having an interesting relationship, and then Spain and Portugal, or here and there, like there will be certain nations who will just vote always the top points to the next nation along. And then the UK has been drifting a little bit away from Europe, so no one's voted for it. We've had like nil point for many years, and then we did Brexit, and that didn't go down very well with the Europeans. But then last year, it was all pretty interesting. And last year, it makes a difference when we had a really good singer, Sam Ryder, who's a really good singer and a lovely guy, and he was going to win. He was going to win Eurovision, and this was like, the UK was just like, this is amazing. And he had a massive TikTok following, so he's a huge TikTok singer. He can belt out these incredible notes. And so loads of the vote gets done by a judging panel in each country and a popular vote. So there's 2 elements to the voting, and then that gets combined. And the public vote was really in favor of the UK guy because everyone knew him on TikTok. But also the Ukraine war happened, and Ukraine, the song was pretty good, but it got the kind of public vote as well as judges. There was a lot of love for Ukraine last year. So Ukraine ended up winning in the year that the UK could have won. And we're like, what are the chances? We haven't won for years, since Bucks Fizz and whatnot, or whatever it was. Actually, no, didn't we win I was in backpacking in Australia in 1996. And Katrina and the Waves, who are Australia now in Eurovision, weirdly, they won for us, didn't they? Anyway, whatever. So that has meant that Ukraine won, but they can't host it. So the winning nation hosts the Eurovision. It's actually a massive expenditure. But it's a huge event, and actually takes place over several days, because now there are so many nations that want in. It's part of like being in Europe, that you got a load of nations in the Caucasus and elsewhere, Azerbaijan, Armenia, all these places out eastwards. That actually there has to be like semi-finals and then a final. So this is a really important, I guess, way of Ukraine to say we're part of Europe as well, to succeed in the Eurovision, and to be part of that kind of team of modern, outward-looking Europeans. Okay. What happened is Ukraine couldn't host it this year. They won, but they couldn't host it for obvious security reasons. So the UK coming in second said, okay, we'll host it in, and we had a competitions where we're going to host it, and it's in Liverpool. And actually there's loads of amazing stories about, you know, Liverpool opening their arms here, as you can see, to Ukrainians. You got quite a few Ukrainian refugees in the UK, although not as many, due to the difficulty it was for many Ukrainians to get like visas, etc., etc. But anyway, this is going to be big news over the weekend. This will be big geopolitical news, in a sense that arguably some of the voting is going to be really interesting to see where people's votes go around Europe, or whether there's a tiredness with Ukraine, whether they're going to move on, or whether they explicitly won't have a political vote and it'll be on the songs, or whether people will just flock to Ukraine again. It's going to be interesting to see how that all goes. So the Eurovision will be, whether you like it or not, an important part of the Ukraine news sphere over the coming couple of days. Well, particularly tonight, where I think it's taking place tonight, isn't it? Saturday. So anyway, that's news today. I could go into loads of lovely articles about how welcoming it has been for the Ukrainians in, say, Liverpool, and you know how the Eurovision Village has a little place for Ukrainians there. You know, it's a real discover Ukraine in the Eurovision Village, so on and so forth. So lots to delve into. I might look into that in an extra. But anyway, that's the news for today. Please like, share, subscribe, do all those funky things. Really appreciate all of you. Thank you so much, and I'll hopefully speak to you soon.